Welcome to the deep dive. I want to start by speaking directly to you for a second, the listener tuning in right now.
Yeah, we know exactly why you're here.
Right, you're here because you have a very specific kind of appetite. You're constantly searching for that cognitive shift.
That aha moment.
Exactly, that incredibly satisfying moment where a massive, complex system just suddenly snaps into focus and makes perfect sense. And you want the actual substance of it, right? Without having to wade through all the unnecessary academic padding.
Which is exactly our mission today. We are embarking on a really detailed exploration into the literal mechanics of why you do what you do.
Okay, let's unpack this. The foundation for today's exploration is a fascinating set of sources. We've got comprehensive notes and audio recordings from a university lecture.
And this lecture maps out one of the most seismic, ground-shaking shifts in the entire history of psychology.
It's massive. We are looking at the great migration from the shadowy theoretical world of psychoanalysis into the brightly lit, highly mechanical realm of behaviorism.
And what's crucial here is that this is a profound transition to study because this material, it serves as much more than just a historical retrospective.
Right, it's not just a history lesson.
No, not at all. It actually functions as a user manual for human habits. By analyzing this specific lecture and the historical pivot it describes, we're essentially looking at the blueprints of our own neurological wiring.
I love that.
It highlights this eternal underlying tension that governs all of human life. The struggle between our hidden internal desires, those abstract thoughts we can't easily quantify, and the external environmental forces that quietly condition our every move.
So let's begin by examining the initial breakdown of that established psychological order. The lecture we're analyzing actually starts with a pretty generous concession to psychoanalysis.
It does. The lecture actually admits to having some psychoanalytic leanings themselves.
Yeah, they acknowledge that the work of figures like Sigmund Freud was undeniably groundbreaking for its time.
But the tone shifts very quickly.
Very quickly. They immediately pivot to dissecting the severe, almost insurmountable limitations of that approach. And the primary hurdle they identify is the empiricism problem. Psychoanalysis was fundamentally incompatible with the scientific method as it was evolving.
And that incompatibility stems from the very nature of what psychoanalysis attempts to study, right? When your entire theoretical framework is built upon unconscious drives, repressed memories, and, invisible structures like the id, ego, and superego.
You run into a massive structural wall regarding experimental empiricism.
Precisely, because science relies on observation, measurement, and replication. How do you definitively measure an unconscious wish?
You can't.
How do you isolate a repressed memory in a controlled laboratory setting? The short answer is you generally can't.
The source actually includes a really sharp joke from the lecturer about this exact frustration. They mention that if a researcher actually attempts to design a rigorous, scientifically sound study to definitively prove a psychoanalytic concept.
Oh, right, the 10-year joke.
Yeah. The methodology required is so convoluted and time-consuming that by the time the study yields any usable data, all of your colleagues have already achieved tenure, and you are still waiting on your results.
It's delivered as a joke, but it points to a very real professional hazard for psychologists at that time. It illustrates perfectly why the discipline had to evolve. A scientific field simply cannot progress if its core tenets are structurally immune to testing.
Exactly. Psychoanalysis was a discipline built entirely for the localized environment of the clinic. It relied almost completely on subjective interpretation rather than the objective environment of the laboratory.
And beyond the methodological flaws, the source dives really deeply into the theoretical limitations too. Specifically, Freud's overarching theory of human motivation.
Right. Freud attempted to distill the vast, chaotic spectrum of human behavior down to two primary driving forces: sex and aggression.
And the lecturer dryly notes that, having taught undergraduate male college students for many years, sex and aggression might actually serve as a fairly accurate and exhaustive list of motives for that specific demographic.
I mean, it's a hilarious observation. But it underscores the absurdity of applying that reductionist framework to the entirety of the human experience. As a universal baseline for motivation, reducing everything to those two biological imperatives just falls incredibly short.
The notes even mention that modern adherents to psychoanalysis have largely had to pivot on this. They've shifted their terminology from raw, animalistic drives to the slightly more nuanced concept of wishes, which at least allows for a broader spectrum of human desire.
The lecture then highlights where these theoretical shortcomings became glaringly apparent, particularly regarding female sexuality. The source is very clear in presenting Freud's framework here as fundamentally flawed.
Yes, heavily reliant on concepts like penis envy.
Right, attempting to explain the entirety of female personality development through a lens of inherent lack or biological jealousy.
The lecturer makes a crucial sociological distinction here, though. They point out that within the context of a deeply patriarchal culture, a society that heavily advantages males socially, economically, and politically, a sense of envy regarding the privileges afforded to men might make a certain twisted sociological sense.
Sure, from a purely societal standpoint.
But Freud wasn't pitching this as a sociological observation. He was pitching it as a biological, universal, psychological baseline. And as a universal scientific absolute, it was deeply problematic and unsupportable.
It was so unsupportable that the source material details Freud's own ultimate frustration with his theories on the matter. He essentially hit a theoretical dead end, threw his hands up in the air, and declared that it was a good thing he had a daughter, Anna, who might be able to figure these things out better than he ever could.
He effectively outsourced the entirety of female psychology to Anna Freud.
He really did. He
Right.
abandoned his own framework because it just wasn't cohesive.
That is a staggering admission of theoretical defeat from the architect of a discipline. But the critique laid out in the lecture expands far beyond just motivation or gender theories. What's fascinating here is perhaps the most devastating critique of psychoanalysis presented in this source.
Which is its near-total blindness to everyday functional human life.
Exactly. Psychoanalysis was entirely consumed by global psychopathology. It was endlessly fascinated by profound trauma, deep neuroses, and the dark, tangled roots of psychological suffering.
But it had absolutely zero vocabulary for normalcy. If you were suffering from a debilitating hysterical paralysis, psychoanalysis had volumes of theory for you. But if you were just trying to recall the name of a neighbor you knew when you were 10 years old or trying to learn how to ride a bicycle, it had virtually nothing to offer.
It completely ignored the mechanics of everyday adaptive functioning. The source highlights this massive blind spot using an anecdote about a psychoanalyst named Peter Fry.
Right, Peter Fry was a vocal critic of this specific limitation.
In the lecture, Fry poses a hypothetical scenario designed to expose the absurdity of applying psychoanalytic theory to mundane tasks. He asks the audience to imagine asking a devout psychoanalyst to explain the psychological mechanics of a professor simply standing at a podium and delivering a lecture.
And the resulting psychoanalytic explanation is comical in its uselessness. The analyst would be forced to say something along the lines of, well, the professor's ego is directing the motor functions of the mouth, and the ego is currently managing the language centers to form words, and the ego is synthesizing the thoughts as they speak.
It becomes an exercise in meaningless labeling. Calling the ability to speak or recall information an ego function provides absolutely zero insight into how memory actually works, how language is acquired, or how cognitive processes operate in real time.
It's just the illusion of an explanation, wrapping a mystery in a piece of jargon and calling it science.
But this limitation becomes far more serious than just academic bickering when you apply it to acute clinical situations. The lecture moves from the podium to the emergency room, bringing up the phenomenon of a panic attack.
Yeah. Anyone who has experienced a severe panic attack knows that it is not a theoretical exercise. Your heart rate explodes, your breathing becomes shallow and erratic, and your brain is flooded with a sheer, overwhelming sensation of impending doom. It is an acute physiological crisis.
And in the immediate aftermath of that kind of physiological terror, gaining deep, probing, psychoanalytic insight into your early childhood relationship with your parents is fundamentally useless.
Totally useless. Unpacking the hidden symbolism of your recent dreams does not stop a racing heart.
The lecturer explains the mechanics of what is actually happening. After that first terrifying panic attack, the human brain does something very simple and very logical. It becomes terrified of experiencing that sensation again.
The fear of having another panic attack actually becomes the trigger that initiates the next panic attack. It becomes a self-sustaining loop.
As the source notes, at that precise moment, the panic is no longer about hidden trauma. It has become a conditioned response.
Your body is biologically reacting to its own internal cues. And you cannot talk a conditioned physical reflex out of existence by analyzing the unconscious. You need an entirely different mechanical tool set to break that cycle.
Now, the lecturer does offer a nuanced caveat here, which is important to note. They maintain that in a clinical setting, they would still find value in evaluating a panic disorder patient psychoanalytically over the long term.
Because there might be broader underlying personality structures or environmental stressors maintaining a baseline of anxiety.
Right. However, the acute immediate mechanism of the panic attack itself, the biological loop, requires a concrete understanding of behavioral conditioning.
Mm.
The abstract tools fail when the problem is mechanical.
That distinction perfectly sets the stage for the paradigm shift.
Yeah.
But to truly put a bow on the era of psychoanalysis, the source delivers a metaphor, or a joke, really, that perfectly encapsulates how different academic disciplines approach the search for truth.
Oh, the black cat metaphor.
Yes, it is a brilliantly concise summary of the behaviorist frustration.
It's a devastatingly effective piece of academic satire.
So the lecturer sets the scene. A student approaches a professor and asks for a definition of science. The professor replies, "Science is like looking for a black cat in a dark room." The student absorbs this, the idea of searching for something elusive but tangible.
Then the student asks, what is philosophy?
Right, and the professor considers this and replies, "Philosophy is looking for a black cat in a dark room where there is no black cat."
A standard, albeit sharp, critique of philosophical abstraction.
But the punchline arrives when the student asks, "Professor, what is psychoanalysis?" The professor doesn't miss a beat and says, "Psychoanalysis is looking for a black cat in a dark room where there is no black cat and finding one."
And finding one. That joke isolates the exact danger that behaviorists saw in the psychoanalytic method.
When a discipline is entirely reliant on subjective interpretation, and the practitioner is desperate to find hidden meaning in every shadow, they will inevitably start manufacturing evidence.
They will, as the lecturer poetically describes it, mistake their own eyelashes for a feline whisker. If an analyst declares that a patient's dream about a train represents a repressed, aggressive wish, there is absolutely no mechanism to verify if that interpretation is grounded in reality, or if it is merely the analyst projecting their own theoretical fantasies onto the patient.
Yet, despite the sharpness of that critique, the lecture provides a very necessary moment of balance. The lecturer defends the utility of psychoanalysis one final time before moving on.
They point out that the behaviorist rebellion, which essentially decided to just flip on the harsh overhead lights, examine only what is manifestly observable, and declare that anything unobservable is either irrelevant or non-existent, that creates its own massive set of blind spots.
The lecturer suggests that, despite the lack of empirical rigor, sometimes the actual profound substance of the human experience truly does reside in those unmeasurable shadows.
And that is the crucial tension to keep in mind. The behaviorists prioritized measurable certainty over comprehensive understanding. They traded the messy, unprovable depths of the human mind for the clean, undeniable data of observable action.
And that trade-off defines the era roughly spanning the 1920s through the late 1960s in America, where behaviorism didn't just become a popular theory, it became the absolute, dominant, overriding force in the field of psychology.
We are now officially leaving the therapist's couch and entering the rigid constraints of the laboratory.
To truly comprehend the sheer force of this new era, the blank slate rebellion, as we might call it, we have to look at what exactly they were trying to tear down. Behaviorism did not evolve gently from clinical observation.
It was a hostile takeover.
Born in laboratories, largely by researchers observing animals in highly controlled environments. Philosophically, they identified two massive, entrenched targets that they believed were holding science back. The first target was Cartesian dualism.
Cartesian dualism, formulated by the 17th century philosopher René Descartes, is the foundational concept of the mind-body split.
Right, the idea that the mind and body are separate.
Exactly. It's the deeply ingrained cultural and philosophical belief that human beings possess a physical, mechanical body governed by the laws of nature, but also possess a distinct, immaterial entity, a mind, or a soul that operates independently of those physical laws.
The source notes the almost comical historical detail that Descartes actually attempted to physically locate this immaterial soul.
He did. He ultimately decided it resided in the pineal gland, a tiny, unsymmetrical structure in the center of the brain.
From the perspective of a 20th century scientist trying to establish psychology as a rigorous, hard science on par with physics or chemistry, Cartesian dualism was an absolute nightmare.
If you accept the premise that human behavior is directed by an unmeasurable, immaterial soul that possesses free will, you are essentially admitting that behavior is fundamentally unpredictable.
Imagine attempting to isolate variables in an experiment. If you observe a subject making a choice, and your ultimate explanation for that choice is their invisible, autonomous soul simply decided to do it freely, you have hit an absolute dead end.
Science cannot function without the presumption of causality. You cannot quantify, predict, or replicate free will. Therefore, the behaviorist rebellion required a radical, almost brutal philosophical simplification.
They took a sledgehammer to dualism. The behaviorist stance was incredibly stark. There is no separate mind. There is no immaterial soul. We are nothing but biology and reflex.
They argued that human beings are entirely mechanisms. Every thought, every action, every emotional response can ultimately be reduced to bodily mechanics, governed by environmental inputs and physical laws just as rigid and predictable as gravity.
It was a shocking reduction of the human experience. With dualism theoretically sidelined, they turned to their second major target, introspective psychology.
The source brings up Wilhelm Wundt here, a late 19th century pioneer who attempted to study the mind by having subjects perform a task like solving a puzzle or recalling an event, and then simply asking them to look inward and report the contents of their own consciousness.
He wanted them to describe their thoughts in real time.
But the behaviorists looked at that methodology and saw a fatal flaw regarding scientific validity. Introspection is inherently, inescapably private.
I am the only person who has access to the contents of my mind. You cannot see my thoughts. If I tell you I am visualizing a red apple, you have to take my word for it.
And science demands public observation and independent verification. If a chemist mixes two compounds and reports a reaction, another chemist must be able to mix those same compounds and witness the exact same reaction.
If psychology was going to be a science, it couldn't rely on private, unverified reports of internal states. If a researcher cannot independently measure your thought, that thought cannot be used as the foundational data for a scientific theory.
And if they despised Wundt's introspective method of asking people about their conscious thoughts, you can imagine their sheer disdain for psychoanalysis.
Oh, Freud wasn't even asking people about their conscious thoughts. He was building entire theories upon unconscious processes that even the patient couldn't verify. From a strict empirical standpoint, it was madness.
This deep skepticism of anything innate or unobservable led them directly to the philosophical bedrock of their movement. They resurrected and heavily leaned upon the work of the Enlightenment philosopher John Locke, specifically his concept of the tabula rasa.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The blank slate. This is where the behaviorist view of humanity becomes truly profound. They posited that human beings are born into this world completely devoid of innate predispositions.
You do not inherit a personality.
You are not born with a specific temperament, inherent beliefs, or deep-seated fears. You arrive as an entirely blank canvas.
According to this doctrine, everything that makes you who you are, your specific anxieties, your preferences, your entire behavioral repertoire, is exclusively the result of a complex, ongoing history of learning experiences.
The environment acts as the pen, constantly writing upon your blank slate.
And crucially, they believed that this writing process, this conditioning, occurred according to universal, mathematically observable laws that were so fundamental they applied equally to a rat navigating a maze, a pigeon pecking a disc, or a human being navigating society.
This brings us to the actual mechanics of how that slate gets written on. The lecture transitions into what is formerly known as classical conditioning. But looking at the history of it, it really should be called the accidental science.
Because the first monumental breakthrough didn't come from a psychologist trying to solve the mystery of the mind.
No, it came completely by accident from a Russian physiologist who was just trying to understand digestion, Ivan Pavlov.
Pavlov is one of the most consequential figures in modern science, and his primary interest was just the gastrointestinal system. He was running a highly specific physiological experiment.
The source material paints a very vivid, almost industrial picture of Pavlov's laboratory setup. He's working with dogs. The lecturer jokingly refers to the archetypal dog as Spotsky or Alpov.
To ensure clean data regarding the digestive process, the dog is placed into a restrictive harness so it remains perfectly still.
Right. A bowl of meat powder is placed in front of the dog, and to precisely measure the digestive response, a surgical tube is inserted into the dog's cheek to collect saliva into a measuring beaker. The lecturer makes a point of clarifying, with a bit of dry humor, that this tube is a serious piece of medical equipment, not a drinking straw for a Slurpee.
Pavlov is initially just documenting a fundamental biological reflex. You present food to a hungry animal, and the animal's body automatically begins the digestive process by salivating. There is absolutely no learning involved in this step. It is hardwired biology.
But then the paradigm shifts due to a laboratory anomaly. Pavlov notices a bizarre disruption in his data. The dogs begin salivating before the meat is even presented.
They start salivating at the sound of the laboratory assistant's footsteps, Or, more famously, at the sound of a bell that happened to ring in the background as the food was being prepared.
And to a physiologist, a dog salivating at the sound of a bell is biological nonsense. A bell offers zero nutritional value. It is a completely neutral environmental stimulus. The digestive system should have no reaction to it whatsoever.
The realization of why this was happening unlocked the first major law of behaviorism. Let's map out the mechanics of this reflex, because while the terminology can sound a bit dense, the underlying logic is incredibly elegant.
The process is divided into two distinct phases. Phase 1 is the innate biology, the unconditioned reflex.
The word unconditioned simply means unlearned. It is the default factory setting. In this scenario, the meat is the unconditioned stimulus. It naturally causes a reaction. The resulting salivation is the unconditioned response. Nature handles this entirely. The brain doesn't have to figure anything out.
Phase 2 is where the environment writes on the blank slate, the learning phase. Pavlov starts intentionally pairing the stimuli. He rings the bell, then immediately presents the meat. Ring the bell, present the meat. Over and over.
Initially, the bell means nothing. But very rapidly, the dog's nervous system detects the environmental pattern. The bell becomes a reliable predictor that meat is imminent.
This creates the conditioned reflex. Conditioned means learned. Through sheer repetition, the previously neutral bell has transformed into a conditioned stimulus.
And the salivation that now occurs merely at the sound of the bell, even if new meat is present, is the conditioned response. The animal's biology has been hijacked by the environment. It is now physiologically responding to a sound as if it were a piece of food.
It is incredibly easy to hear about a dog strapped into a harness and dismiss it as a quirk of animal training. But the entire premise of the behaviorist movement is that these laws apply universally.
To you and me.
Exactly. The source provides several excellent examples of how deeply this exact same mechanical conditioning is embedded in everyday human life. If you have ever owned a cat and an electric can opener, you have witnessed classical conditioning in its purest form.
It is the modern domestic equivalent of Pavlov's laboratory.
You pull the electric can opener out of a drawer. The second that motor engages and makes that specific whirring sound, your cat comes sprinting into the kitchen from 3 rooms away, meowing frantically and weaving between your legs.
Why? Because the cat's brain has linked that specific mechanical sound, the conditioned stimulus, with the arrival of dinner.
And the truly fascinating part is the rigidity of the conditioning. The cat will exhibit this intense food-seeking response, even if you're just using the can opener to open a tin of green beans for yourself. The conditioned response overrides the immediate reality.
The lecturer points out that human beings are operating under these same invisible tethers constantly. Consider a standard office environment. You are deeply engrossed in a spreadsheet, completely focused on your work. You happen to glance up at the wall and the clock reads exactly 12:00 p.m. or 6:00 p.m. In that exact instant, you feel a sharp, undeniable pang of hunger in your stomach.
That hunger is not a sudden, emergent biological necessity. At 11:59 a.m., your stomach was perfectly content. But you have undergone years of classical conditioning, pairing the specific visual stimulus of the clock hands at that specific angle with the act of eating.
Your digestive system is literally taking cues from a piece of plastic on the wall. You are salivating at a clock.
A more intense example provided in the source relates to the conditioning of anxiety, specifically around academic testing. They ask you to imagine a 4-year-old child in a classroom. The teacher walks silently down the aisle, handing out blank pieces of paper. To a 4-year-old, this is a neutral or even positive stimulus. They assume it's time to draw or color.
But fast forward 15 years. You're a 19-year-old university student. The professor walks silently down the aisle, handing out a stack of papers. The physiological reaction is entirely different. Your heart rate elevates, your palms sweat. You feel a pit of dread in your stomach.
A completely neutral physical action. A human being handing you a piece of milled wood pulp has been paired so consistently with the high-stakes stress of evaluation that it now automatically triggers a physiological fear response. You have been conditioned to panic at the sight of paper.
Which brings us to one of the most foundational, famous, and ethically controversial experiments in the history of psychology, the case of Little Albert, orchestrated by John B. Watson.
Watson wanted to prove that complex human emotions, specifically fear, were not the result of deep unconscious conflicts or innate temperament, but were simply mechanically conditioned reflexes.
The details of this experiment are stark. Little Albert was a 9-month-old infant. Watson's goal was to artificially manufacture a phobia. He started by establishing a baseline, presenting Albert with various objects: a live white rat, a rabbit, a dog, a Santa Claus mask with a fluffy white beard.
And Albert showed no innate fear of any of these items. He was a calm baby. He even reached out to play with the rat.
Having established that the blank slate was indeed blank regarding these objects, Watson introduced a deeply aversive, unconditioned stimulus. Behind the infant, out of his line of sight, Watson held a heavy steel bar. Every time little Albert reached out to touch the white rat, Watson would strike the steel bar with a hammer, creating a deafening, terrifying clang.
The source is careful to note that Watson struck the bar behind the baby's head, not on his head, but the acoustic shock was immense. The loud noise is an unconditioned stimulus that naturally, biologically, produces a fear and startle response in an infant. Albert would violently flinch and begin to cry.
Watson repeated this pairing: rat, clang, crying, rat, clang, crying. It took very few repetitions for the conditioning to take hold. Soon Watson presented the white rat in complete silence.
Little Albert's reaction was immediate and severe. He began crying hysterically and desperately tried to crawl away. The previously neutral white rat had become a powerful conditioned stimulus, eliciting a conditioned response of sheer terror. Watson had successfully manufactured a phobia from scratch.
The experiment yielded another profound discovery regarding how the brain processes learning, a phenomenon known as stimulus generalization. Albert's brain didn't just narrowly associate the fear with that one specific rat in that specific room. His nervous system generalized the danger to anything that shared similar visual characteristics.
He developed an intense terror of white rabbits. He cried at the sight of a woman's white fur coat. He even exhibited terror when presented with that fuzzy Santa Claus mask. The conditioning bled outward, attaching fear to an entire category of visual inputs.
The lecturer uses this specific detail to deliver a devastating critique of the psychoanalytic method we discussed earlier. They ask the audience to imagine a hypothetical scenario where little Albert, now 20 years older, walks into a psychoanalyst's office seeking treatment for a debilitating, inexplicable phobia of Christmas and Santa Claus.
The implication is obvious and hilarious. The psychoanalyst, armed with Freud's theories, would spend years excavating Albert's unconscious. They would construct elaborate theories about repressed childhood trauma, perhaps theorizing a deep-seated castration anxiety linked to a bearded father figure.
They would build an entire narrative architecture around this fear, completely oblivious to the empirical reality that 20 years prior, a researcher named Watson banged a steel pipe behind his head every time something white and fuzzy was in the room.
It perfectly encapsulates the behaviorist argument that psychoanalysis often invents complex, mythical narratives to explain simple, observable conditioning errors.
And the behaviorist framework also offers a mechanical solution to these errors. If a fear can be conditioned into the nervous system, the assumption is that it can also be conditioned out. This is the mechanism of extinction.
Returning to Pavlov's laboratory, the process of extinction is straightforward. If you've conditioned a dog to salivate at a bell, and you subsequently ring that bell 50 times in a row but never present the meat powder, the environment is communicating new data.
The bell is no longer a reliable predictor. The dog's nervous system eventually updates its software, recognizes that the association has been broken, and ceases the salivation response. The conditioned reflex becomes extinct.
However, the behaviorists soon ran into a profound complication regarding their absolute belief in the tabula rasa. They initially operated under the assumption of equipotentiality, the belief that the blank slate was truly blank, and therefore you could successfully condition an animal or a human to associate any two stimuli with equal ease.
A bell and meat, a light and a shock, a rat and a loud noise. The laws of learning were supposed to be completely indifferent to the nature of the stimuli.
But the natural world presented a glaring inconsistency that shattered this assumption. It leads us to what we can call the evolutionary caveat. This raises an important question, right?
It does. The source raises a brilliant, intuitive question to the audience. If human beings are truly blank slates, and all learning is simply a matter of environmental conditioning, why is there such a massive universal prevalence of specific phobias, like a terror of snakes or spiders?
The lecture highlights the statistical absurdity of this under a strict behaviorist model. They ask the room how many people have actually suffered a snake bite. Very few. Yet how many harbor a deep instinctual fear of snakes? Almost everyone.
If we are completely blank slates, whose fears are dictated entirely by our direct learning experiences, we should theoretically be far more terrified of common objects that routinely cause us minor pain, like paper cuts from envelopes or the sharp claws of our own house cats. Yet we don't develop widespread phobias of paper or kittens.
This inconsistency forced the field to acknowledge the concept of prepared learning. The slate is not entirely blank. It comes with evolutionary watermarks. Millions of years of natural selection have pre-wired our nervous systems to learn certain critical associations incredibly quickly because those specific associations were vital for the survival of our ancestors.
The definitive, paradigm-shifting proof of this biological reality came from an elegant, now famous experiment by researchers Garcia and Kelling, often referred to as the bright, noisy water experiment.
This experiment is a masterpiece of isolating variables. Garcia and Kelling wanted to definitively test if an organism would link different types of environmental cues like visual lights, auditory sounds, internal tastes with different types of negative physical consequences, specifically internal nausea versus external physical pain.
Picture the sensory environment they constructed for these rats. A rat is placed in a chamber and exposed to 3 distinct stimuli simultaneously. A bright light flashes, a loud noise sounds, and the rat is given water that has been tainted with a slightly sweet flavor. Bright, noisy, sweet water.
The researchers then divide the rats into 2 distinct groups to experience different aversive consequences. For group 1, immediately after consuming the sweet water in the bright, noisy environment, the rats are exposed to X-ray radiation. The radiation induces intense gastrointestinal distress. It essentially gives the rats a severe case of nausea.
After they recover, Group 1 is tested to see what they learned. The results demonstrate a highly specific, targeted association. The rats develop an absolute immediate aversion to the sweet water. They refuse to touch it.
But when tested with the bright light or the loud noise, they show zero fear response. They completely ignored the visual and auditory cues that were present when they got sick.
Now contrast this with Group 2. This group drinks the sweet water in the bright, noisy environment, but instead of radiation-induced nausea, they are delivered a sharp electric shock to their feet. They experience acute, external physical pain.
The learning outcome for Group 2 is the exact mirror image. When tested, these rats exhibit massive anxiety and fear responses when exposed to the bright light and the loud noise. But the sweet water, they happily drink it. They do not associate the external physical pain with the taste of the water.
The elegance of this experiment lies in what it proves about the architecture of the brain. The rats were not learning blindly. Their nervous systems were evolutionarily prepared to make specific connections. In the natural world, if an animal experiences violent gastrointestinal distress, the cause is almost certainly something they ingested.
It is deeply advantageous to immediately associate nausea with taste. It is evolutionarily useless to associate nausea with a random flash of lightning.
Conversely, if an animal experiences sudden, sharp external pain, it is likely an attack by a predator, which is usually preceded by a visual cue or a sudden sound like a snapping twig. You don't get an electric shock from eating a bad berry.
We see the sheer, unyielding power of this evolutionary preparedness constantly in human life through the phenomenon of taste aversions. Unlike Pavlov's dogs, which required multiple pairings of the bell and the meat, a taste aversion often requires only a single trial. One bad experience can permanently alter your behavior. The source includes a highly relatable anecdote from the lecturer to illustrate how logic is entirely useless against this wiring.
The lecturer recounts a childhood experience of eating a bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich at a diner located within a department store. They specify Woolworths, though they add a humorous legal caveat to the camera that Woolworths wasn't actually responsible for what followed. Later that evening, the lecturer contracted a severe stomach virus and was violently ill.
Now, the lecturer was an educated individual. Intellectually, logically, they understood that the BLT did not cause the illness. The illness was caused by a viral pathogen. The sandwich was innocent.
But the evolutionary wiring of the brain does not consult your intellect. The primitive centers of the nervous system simply registered a sequence of events. Novel taste of BLT, followed a few hours later by profound nausea. The brain instantly concluded that the BLT was poison.
The lecturer admits that they were entirely unable to consume a BLT for 15 years after that single event. The association was locked in, completely bypassing conscious reason.
The source also notes a very sobering, real-world medical application of this mechanism. Patients undergoing intense treatments like chemotherapy or radiation often suffer from severe, unavoidable nausea as a side effect. Because the brain is so aggressively primed to link nausea to food, these patients frequently develop intense taste aversions to whatever normal healthy foods they happen to consume in the days surrounding their treatment.
Over time, their diet can become dangerously restricted, not because the food is harmful, but because the brain is falsely flagging every meal as the source of the chemical distress. It is a stark reminder that while the environment writes the code, evolution provides the operating system.
That underlying architecture is crucial to understand as the lecture transitions into the second major paradigm of the behaviorist era. We move away from classical conditioning and into the realm of operant conditioning, championed most famously by B.F. Skinner. If Pavlov's work explained the mechanics of our involuntary reflexes, Skinner's work attempted to explain the architecture of our voluntary choices.
This distinction between involuntary and voluntary is the core difference. Classical conditioning is about things that happen to you. You don't choose to salivate, you don't choose to feel nauseous, you don't choose to have your heart race when a test paper is handed out. Those responses are automatic. The behaviorist terminology is that these responses are elicited by the environment pulling a biological trigger.
Operant conditioning, however, focuses on behaviors that are emitted by the organism. These are voluntary actions. You choose to walk across a room, you choose to speak a word, a rat chooses to press a lever. The organism operates on the environment, which is where the term operant comes from, and the entire theory hinges on what the environment does in response.
It completely flips the chronological order of Pavlov's model. In classical conditioning, the environmental stimulus comes first, the bell rings, and the behavior follows, the dog salivates. In operant conditioning, the organism's behavior comes first, the rat presses a lever, and the environmental stimulus follows as a consequence, a food pellet drops.
This sequence forms the basis of what Edward Thorndike called the law of effect. It is a brutally simple but incredibly powerful rule. Actions are selected by their consequences. If an organism emits a behavior, and that behavior is immediately followed by a positive consequence, the mathematical probability that the organism will repeat that behavior in the future increases. If the consequence is negative, the probability decreases. Behavior is literally shaped by the friction it encounters in the world.
The primary tool for increasing a behavior is reinforcement. Let's start with positive reinforcement, which is intuitive. You add a desirable consequence immediately following a behavior to ensure the behavior happens again. The classic demonstration of this is the Skinner box.
Imagine a specialized, controlled enclosure containing a pigeon. Pigeons are naturally active, they constantly emit random behaviors, wandering around and pecking at things. In this box, there is a specific target disc on the wall. The pigeon, just through random exploration, happens to peck the disc. Instantly, an automated mechanism drops a single pellet of grain into a hopper.
The pigeon eats the grain. It goes back to wandering, eventually pecking the disc again. Bam, another pellet of grain. The environment is providing immediate positive reinforcement. Within a very short period, the random wandering ceases, and the pigeon is aggressively and continuously pecking the disc until it is completely full. The behavior has been acquired and maximized.
What is critical to understand about Skinner's approach here is his absolute refusal to engage with internal states. A layperson might watch that pigeon and say, the pigeon figured out the puzzle, or the pigeon realizes that pecking gets food, or the pigeon feels happy when it gets the grain. Skinner rejected all of that language.
Right. In Skinner's world, there's no cartoon light bulb illuminating over the pigeon's head. He didn't care if the pigeon had an epiphany. He cared only about the empirical equation. Action A, pecking, was followed by consequence B, food, resulting in an observable increase in the frequency of action A.
The environment is a machine stamping a behavioral regularity into the nervous system. The internal subjective experience is irrelevant to the measurable output.
We see this exact dynamic driving human society at every level. When a parent says thank you to a child for picking up a toy, that is positive reinforcement designed to increase future compliance. Good grades in school are tokens of positive reinforcement. A year-end bonus or a sales commission at work is a highly structured schedule of positive reinforcement designed to increase the specific operant of productivity. The mechanism is identical to the grain in the Skinner box.
Now, we must address a concept that the lecturer highlights as perhaps the most consistently misunderstood principle in all of psychology. If we connect the bigger picture, negative reinforcement is astonishingly frequently misused even in professional settings.
The vast majority of people assume that negative reinforcement is simply a synonym for punishment. They're completely distinct concepts serving opposite behavioral goals.
Listen closely to this fundamental rule. Reinforcement, whether it is positive or negative, always has the goal of increasing the probability of a behavior. Positive reinforcement increases a behavior by adding something desirable. Negative reinforcement increases a behavior by removing something deeply aversive or unpleasant.
You are rewarding the organism with relief. And because relief feels good, whatever action caused the relief is powerfully strengthened.
The source provides a vivid, somewhat harsh laboratory example to clarify this. Imagine a rat in a specialized cage where the metal floor grid can be electrified. The electricity is turned on, delivering a painful shock. This is an aversive stimulus. The rat is in distress, scrambling erratically around the cage. Purely by accident, it bumps into a specific lever protruding from the wall. Instantly, the electricity is cut off. The pain stops. Relief.
A few minutes later, the floor is electrified again. The rat scrambles, eventually hits the lever, and the shock ends. It takes very few trials for the rat to make the connection. Soon, the second the electricity turns on, the rat dives directly for the lever. The specific behavioral operant pressing the lever has been drastically increased. It hasn't been punished, it has been reinforced. Why? Because it successfully removed the pain. That is the essence of negative reinforcement.
We employ negative reinforcement constantly to navigate our daily lives. The lecture offers a perfect, mundane example. Imagine it is the middle of August, a sweltering 100-degree day. Your apartment feels like a furnace. The heat is an intense aversive stimulus. You walk across the room and turn on the air conditioning. The blast of cold air immediately removes the aversive stimulus of the heat. You experience relief. Therefore, the behavior of walking over and turning on the AC is powerfully reinforced.
The lecturer even injects a bit of humor, suggesting that college students regularly employ negative reinforcement against their professors. If a professor is delivering a particularly boring, droning lecture, which is an aversive stimulus to the students might turn on a loud, rattling window air conditioning unit to drown out the sound. They are emitting a behavior to remove an annoyance.
The source also points out that negative reinforcement is the engine behind avoidance learning. That rat in the electrified cage won't just learn to turn the shock off once it starts. Eventually, it will learn the subtle cues that precede the shock. It will start hitting the lever before the floor is ever electrified, ensuring it never experiences the pain in the first place. The rat is continuously emitting a behavior solely to avoid an aversive stimulus. Much of human anxiety and procrastination is essentially avoidance learning driven by negative reinforcement.
This naturally leads us into the territory of attempting to stop behaviors, which brings us to the complexities of punishment. If reinforcement is the tool for increasing a behavior, punishment is the tool explicitly designed to decrease a behavior.
The mechanics are the inverse of reinforcement. With punishment, you present an aversive stimulus immediately after an action, with the explicit goal of ensuring that action does not happen again. A parent spanking a child, a judge levying a fine, a teenager being grounded, or simply yelling "no" at a dog chewing a shoe. Or, returning to the laboratory, if Skinner was trying to place food in the box and the pigeon viciously pecked his hand, Skinner might reflexively slap the pigeon back. The slap is a physical punishment intended to decrease the likelihood of the pecking behavior.
But here, the source introduces a concept that reveals the hidden architecture of our social interactions. It is a profound and often hilarious truth about behavioral mechanics. Conditioning is almost never a one-way street. It is constantly reciprocal.
The lecturer references a classic behavioral psychology cartoon to illustrate this. It depicts a pigeon inside a Skinner box, leaning against the glass and speaking to another pigeon outside. The caption reads, "Boy, do I have this Skinner guy conditioned. Every time I peck this target, I can get him to drop food for me."
It perfectly highlights that who is controlling whom is entirely a matter of perspective. Both entities are trapped in a feedback loop of operant conditioning.
The lecture applies this reciprocal loop to a painfully accurate parenting scenario. Imagine you are a parent dealing with a curious 2-year-old toddler. The toddler approaches a low table and reaches for a fragile, expensive glass vase. You panic and yell, "No, don't touch that!" You have just delivered an aversive auditory stimulus. You are attempting to punish the child to decrease the behavior of reaching for the vase.
Let's assume the punishment is effective. The toddler is startled, recoils, and stops reaching for the vase. As a parent, you feel you have successfully managed the situation, but you must ask yourself in that exact moment, what did the toddler just do to you?
The toddler just successfully negatively reinforced you. By stopping their action, the toddler instantly removed the deeply aversive stimulus of your rising panic and anxiety about the vase shattering. Because your anxiety was alleviated, your specific behavior, the act of yelling no, was powerfully reinforced. The toddler is actively, quietly training you to yell whenever you feel stressed.
It is a perfect, closed behavioral loop. You apply a punishment to modify them, and their compliance provides negative reinforcement that modifies you. We are constantly, unconsciously sculpting the behavior of our partners, our children, and our colleagues through these invisible reciprocal exchanges.
To prove just how susceptible even highly educated humans are to this shaping, the lecturer shares my absolute favorite story from the entire source material. It involves a group of psychology students who decided to run a covert operant conditioning experiment on their own professor during a lecture.
It is a brilliant demonstration of a technique called shaping, which we will define more formally in a moment. But essentially, the students wanted to see if they could physically control the professor's movements around the classroom using nothing but their collective attention as a reinforcer.
The setup is ingenious. The professor is lecturing, naturally pacing back and forth across the front of the room. The students all secretly agree on a set of rules. Whenever the professor wanders toward the left side of the room, the entire class will look down at their desks, doodle in their notebooks, and project an aura of complete boredom and disinterest. They are withdrawing their attention, which, to a lecturer, is a subtly aversive stimulus.
However, whenever the professor takes a step toward the right side of the room, the entire class looks up, makes intense eye contact, nods enthusiastically, and pretends to be utterly fascinated by every word. They deliver massive positive reinforcement.
The professor, completely unaware of the game but biologically craving the engagement of the room, unconsciously begins to drift toward the right. It's where the warmth is. Once the professor is solidly on the right side of the room, the students alter the criteria. Now, standing on the right isn't enough to earn their attention. They only look up and nod if he steps to the far right. Step by step, minute by minute, they continuously shift the boundary, reinforcing his movement toward the exit. By the end of the 50-minute class, they have successfully conditioned this highly educated academic to deliver the remainder of his lecture while literally standing in the doorway.
It's a hilarious anecdote, but it exposes the raw power of environmental feedback. We move toward reinforcement, often without any conscious realization that we are being manipulated. However, the lecturer pivots from this humor to issue severe clinical warnings about the use of punishment. The source explicitly outlines 3 major structural problems with relying on punishment as a primary tool for behavioral modification.
The first problem is emotional contamination. The lecturer points out that, unlike a sterile laboratory experiment, in human relationships, punishment is almost invariably administered in a state of anger. A parent doesn't calmly calculate the optimal aversive stimulus to apply to a misbehaving child. They lash out because they are frustrated. Reactive anger clouds judgment and rarely targets the root behavioral issue effectively. It simply creates an atmosphere of fear.
The second major problem is that punishment frequently models the exact behavior it is attempting to eradicate. The source notes the strong statistical correlation between the use of physical punishment in the home and higher rates of physical aggression in children. The logic is tragically simple. If a parent slaps a child and yells, "Don't hit your sister," the child does not absorb the moral lesson of peaceful conflict resolution. The child absorbs the mechanical lesson being demonstrated. When you are angry and someone isn't doing what you want, the effective strategy is to hit them. You're actively training them in aggression.
The third problem is perhaps the most difficult to avoid: punishing the wrong operant. Behavior happens in a continuous stream. When you deliver a punishment, you have to be absolutely certain that the subject links that consequence to the exact action you want to stop. If your timing is off by even a few seconds, you might accidentally punish a completely different, perhaps desirable behavior. To illustrate this, the lecturer shares a painfully funny story about their own failure with a pet.
Yes, the infamous story of Cadbury the cat. It is a masterclass in botched behavioral timing.
The lecturer describes having a small, chocolate brown cat named Cadbury. They lived in an apartment that bordered a dense, inaccessible patch of woods. Cadbury developed a highly undesirable operant behavior. Whenever the front door was opened, Cadbury would act like a coiled spring, dart out at lightning speed, and disappear deep into the woods.
And because the woods were dense, the lecturer couldn't simply walk in and retrieve the cat. They were entirely at Cadbury's mercy.
So the lecturer is trapped in this infuriating routine. They have to stand on the porch, sometimes for an hour, calling out, "Cadbury, come here." Now, anyone who has owned a cat knows they do not adhere to human schedules. They come when they are good and ready, The lecturer is boiling with frustration. They decide that this door-darting behavior must be extinguished, and they resolve to use punishment.
The theoretical plan is sound. Wait for Cadbury to attempt to dart out the door and immediately deliver a physical swat and aversive stimulus to punish the act of escaping.
But the execution is a disaster. Cadbury is vastly quicker than the lecturer. The cat blows past their legs and vanishes into the woods before the lecturer can even raise a hand. So the lecturer is stuck on the porch again, yelling for an hour. Finally, Cadbury decides he's had enough nature, emerges from the brush, and casually trots up to the lecturer's feet. The lecturer, still seething with anger over the escape an hour prior, picks the cat up and then delivers a hard slap on the behind.
Which is a catastrophic failure of basic conditioning principles.
The lecturer freely admits how incredibly stupid this was in retrospect. In the lecturer's human mind, they were punishing the cat for the act of running out the door an hour ago. They were punishing the crime. But cats do not possess the cognitive capacity to connect a punishment to an event that occurred 60 minutes in the past. From Cadbury's perspective, what was the specific operant behavior that immediately preceded the physical assault?
The behavior was returning to the owner. Cadbury's nervous system registers this sequence. I ran out the door, had a fantastic hour exploring the woods. Then I heard my name, I walked over to my human, and I was immediately struck. Note to self, never, under any circumstances, approach the human when they call my name.
The lecturer realized they were actively, forcefully punishing the cat for returning home. It perfectly demonstrates why punishment is such a fraught and fragile tool. If the timing isn't perfect, you often end up exacerbating the exact problem you're trying to solve.
This unreliability of punishment highlights why behaviorists vastly prefer positive reinforcement. But that leads to a complex question, which brings us to the final major section of the source material: sculpting complex behavior. Most of what human beings do in a day, driving a car, playing a sport, holding a conversation, is not a simple, single reflex like a pigeon pecking a disc. Human life is a tapestry of vastly complex actions. How does a behaviorist explain the acquisition of high-level skills?
The foundational technique is what we saw the students use on the professor. Shaping, formerly known as the method of successive approximations. The core philosophy of shaping is patience. You do not demand the final perfected behavior immediately. If you wait for a pigeon to accidentally play a piano before you feed it, the pigeon will starve. Instead, you reward tiny incremental steps that move progressively closer to the ultimate goal.
The lecture utilizes a highly relatable sports analogy to break this down. The lecturer discusses taking tennis lessons to correct a terrible ingrained habit. Whenever the ball approached, the lecturer would panic and do this little hop, jumping entirely off the ground like a jackrabbit right as they swung the racket. From a physics standpoint, you cannot generate power or accuracy while suspended in midair. The habit was destroying their game.
So a skilled coach employs the shaping method. In the first lesson, the coach completely ignores 90% of the swing. The coach doesn't critique the grip on the racket, the follow-through, or the angle of the racket face. They focus exclusively on the feet. The lecturer swings at a ball, hits it terribly, but happens to keep both feet planted on the court. The coach immediately yells, "Good, you didn't hop." The coach delivers positive reinforcement solely for the baseline approximation of the correct behavior.
The lecturer repeats this until staying grounded becomes a reliable operant. But shaping requires escalating demands. Once the baseline is mastered, the criteria for the reward shifts. In the next lesson, the lecturer swings and keeps their feet on the ground, expecting praise. The coach remains silent. The old reward criteria has expired. Now, the coach only delivers the good if the lecturer keeps their feet on the ground and bends their knees.
The progression is key. You reinforce a step until it is solid, then you extinguish that reward and demand the next logical step toward the final complex behavior. If the coach had demanded a flawless professional-level swing on day one and punished every minor deviation, the lecturer would have been overwhelmed, frustrated, and likely quit the sport entirely. Complex learning requires the patient reinforcement of approximations.
A parallel concept to shaping is chaining. While shaping refines a single complex action, chaining is the process of linking several distinct, independently learned behaviors together into one continuous sequence. The critical mechanism in chaining is that the completion of one behavior automatically acts as the trigger, or the environmental cue, that initiates the next behavior in this sequence.
The anecdote provided for chaining sounds almost like a prank, but it perfectly illustrates the mechanics. The lecture reveals that their brother, applying these behavioral principles, successfully trained a house cat to function as a morning alarm clock. The brother's ultimate goal was to have the cat wake the sleeping lecturer by jumping on the bed and licking their face. Now, obviously, you cannot verbally instruct a cat to execute a multi-step morning routine. It has to be chained.
The process the brother used was meticulous. He started at the beginning of the desired sequence. First, the brother placed a small pile of dry cat food on the very bottom step of the staircase that led up from the basement to the bedrooms. He opened the basement door. The cat found the food. He repeated this until the cat learned link 1. Open door equals run to the bottom stair.
Once that link is established, the brother shifts the reinforcer. He stops putting food at the bottom of the stairs and instead places it at the very top of the landing, outside the bedroom door. The door opens, the cat runs to the bottom step, finds no food but smells it above and runs up the stairs. Link 2 is forged.
The next morning, the food is placed inside the threshold of the bedroom. The cat runs up the stairs, enters the room, link 3. The next morning, the food is placed up on the mattress itself. The cat jumps onto the bed, link 4.
And finally, the brother executes the culmination of the chain. While the lecturer is fast asleep, the brother places a piece of dry cat food directly onto the lecturer's face.
The basement door opens. The environmental cue triggers the entire chain. The cat sprints through the house, bounds up the stairs, runs into the bedroom, leaps onto the bed, locates the food on the sleeping face, and begins licking it off, immediately waking the startled lecturer. Within a matter of days, the entire sequence was seamlessly linked. The brother didn't even need to use food eventually. The completion of running up the stairs simply became the automatic trigger to jump on the bed.
It is a phenomenal demonstration of environmental programming. But the final concept the lecture covers is perhaps the most profound for understanding the stubbornness of human habits. It answers the question of why we cling so desperately to behaviors that don't always benefit us. This is the science of schedules of reinforcement.
The lecturer draws a critical distinction between two types of schedules. The first is the continuous schedule. This is a 1-to-1 ratio. Every single time you perform the operant behavior, you receive the reinforcement. You put $1 in a vending machine, you press the button, a soda drops. Every time. The lecture points out that a continuous schedule is unparalleled for learning a new skill initially because the cause and effect are undeniable.
And this is the hinge upon which so much of human suffering and addiction turns. A continuous schedule is incredibly fragile when it comes to maintaining a behavior over the long term. Behaviors built on continuous reinforcement are highly susceptible to rapid extinction if the reward ever stops. To build a truly resilient, bulletproof habit, you must employ an intermittent or partial schedule of reinforcement. You only reward the behavior some of the time, and crucially, you make the reward unpredictable.
To explain why this is so powerful, the lecturer uses an automotive metaphor that I think is absolutely brilliant. It perfectly captures the psychology of persistence. Imagine you own a pristine, brand-new automobile. The lecturer uses the example of a 1991 model, as that was contemporary to the recording. This car is mechanically flawless. Every single morning, you insert the key, turn it, and the engine instantly roars to life. You are on a strict, continuous schedule of reinforcement. Turn key, get engine.
Now imagine a cold morning where you go out to this perfect car, you turn the key, and nothing happens. Silence. You are shocked. You try again. Nothing. You might try turning the key a total of 3 or 4 times, but very quickly, you stop. You step out of the car and call a mechanic. Your key-turning behavior has been instantly extinguished. Why? Because your brain knows the rule. It is supposed to work every time. The fact that it didn't work 3 times proves the system is broken. There is no point in continuing the behavior.
Now contrast that psychological state with the lecturer's other vehicle. An old, beaten-up rust bucket of a 1981 Toyota Corolla, a total clunker. The lecturer has owned this car for years and is deeply accustomed to fighting with it. Sometimes it starts on the first try, sometimes it takes 5 tries. Sometimes you have to pump the gas pedal, utter a prayer, and turn the key 12 times before it finally sputters and catches.
This is an intermittent schedule of reinforcement. The operator never knows exactly how much effort will be required to achieve the reward of a running engine.
So, on a cold morning, the lecturer goes out to the clunker. They turn the key 4 times. Nothing. Do they give up and call a tow truck like they did with the new car? Absolutely not. They are intimately accustomed to the struggle. They will sit in that freezing car and grind that starter motor 15, 20, maybe 30 times without ever considering quitting.
Their behavior has become incredibly immune to extinction. Because the reward has always been unpredictable, the brain's logic shifts. The brain assumes, well, it didn't work the last 10 times, but statistically, the next turn of the key could be the one that works. The unpredictability generates relentless persistence. So what does this all mean?
This mechanism explains so much about the human condition. It is the exact engineered psychological mechanism that explains why human beings gamble. A slot machine is essentially a mathematically perfected clunker car. It doesn't pay out a jackpot every time you pull the lever. If it paid out a dollar exactly every 10th pull, the thrill would vanish. It would just be an hourly wage. The thrill, the addiction, comes from the fact that the jackpot is unpredictable. It might be the next pull. It might be 1,000 pulls from now. That unpredictability creates a behavioral loop that is nearly impossible to voluntarily extinguish.
It explains toxic relationships where affection is doled out unpredictably. It explains why we constantly refresh our email inboxes. We are searching for that intermittent reward. However, the lecture does not end on a fatalistic note. It concludes by showing how these exact, rigid, mechanical principles can be utilized to alleviate profound suffering. It demonstrates therapeutic extinction.
The final clinical case detailed in the notes was reported by a psychologist named Williams. It involves a very young child, a 21-month-old boy. This boy had endured a severe, life-threatening illness. During his protracted recovery, he required round-the-clock 247 medical care and attention from his parents and nurses.
Fortunately, the medical crisis passed. The child was cured and was no longer in any physical danger. However, a severe behavioral pathology had taken root.
During the months of illness, the boy's nervous system learned a highly effective operant behavior. If I cry, scream, or throw a massive tantrum, an adult immediately comes rushing into the room to give me intense attention and comfort. Now that the boy was healthy, the parents could not maintain a 247 vigil. But the boy was still utilizing the behavior, throwing exhausting, continuous tantrums whenever left alone, demanding that the environment respond the way it used to.
The parents were pushed to the brink of collapse. They consulted a behaviorist. The behaviorist took a very clinical approach. First, they mandated a thorough medical evaluation to guarantee the child was entirely healthy and not experiencing any physical pain. Once the medical clearance was absolute, the behaviorist prescribed treatment that is emotionally brutal for a parent to execute, but mechanically flawless: therapeutic extinction.
The behaviorist's instruction was simple. Put the child to bed, close the door, and let him cry. Do not respond, do not run in, do not pick him up, do not scold him. You must completely sever the connection between the operant behavior, the tantrum, and the reinforcer your attention.
The source data on this intervention is striking. It worked with incredible speed. According to the notes, it took only about 10 learning trials, 10 specific instances of the child throwing a tantrum and receiving absolute zero reinforcement from the environment for the behavior to be completely extinguished. The child's nervous system updated. It recognized that the rules of the environment had fundamentally changed, the reward was gone, and the exhausting tantrums ceased entirely.
It is a stark, powerful distillation of Skinner's entire worldview. If you wish to modify the behavior, you must systematically modify the environment that sustains it. We have covered an immense amount of intellectual ground today. We began in the dim, unprovable shadows of Freud's psychoanalytic theory, a world governed by hidden motives, unverified interpretations, and theoretical dead ends. And we traced the Great Migration into the stark, undeniable, mathematically measurable reality of the behaviorist laboratory. We explored how Pavlov's accidental bell fundamentally altered our understanding of biological reflexes, how our evolutionary history quietly prepares us to fear the right things, and how Skinner's operant conditioning proves that our choices, our persistence, and our addictions are largely sculpted by the consequences our environment predictably or unpredictably provides. We want to thank you, the listener, for dedicating your time to this deep dive through the complex mechanics of your own internal wiring.
Before we sign off, I want to offer a final thought for you to carry with you. We spent a significant amount of time discussing the immense power of the intermittent schedule of reinforcement. I want you to look closely at the architecture of your modern digital life. Consider the occasional exciting text message, the sudden dopamine hit of a specific email, or an unexpected burst of likes on a social media post, all of it buried beneath a vast, numb sea of spam and mundane updates. Think back to that metaphor of the 1981 clunker car. If the devices in our pockets are perfectly, intentionally engineered by thousands of software developers to deliver unpredictable, intermittent rewards, you have to ask yourself a difficult question. How much of your daily digital routine, the compulsive swiping, the endless scrolling, the habitual checking, is actually a conscious, autonomous choice? And how much is simply you, sitting in the driver's seat, endlessly turning the key of an old engine, helplessly waiting for the spark?